Peter, let's start with you. Scott Bessent's hearing today. What caught your attention?
Well, look, obviously the tax cuts, I think, is an important topic. And it reminds you, of course, of what happened with the Bush term, right? Bush also passed large tax cuts, and then it was set to expire. And then Obama had to deal with it during his presidency, what part of it to renew and what part not. In Obama's case, he refused to renew the tax cuts for the richest part of the population and allowed the rest to continue. That's presumably what you would hear from Democrats going into this debate. But the difference, of course, is that Trump has control of both houses of Congress. And so what you have is likely some sort of a large deficit adding tax cut. A lot of people will be happy about the tax cut, but it comes at the same time that this president and Elon Musk have promised they're going to somehow find a way to shrink the deficit, which is at very high levels right now. How you square those things, nobody has said.
Andrew, you cover the Hill. How was Bessent received? Because, listen, we heard from Democrats, they don't like the policies he wants to implement, but of course they won't. He's a Republican.
Yeah, exactly. Democrats are viewing these nominations sort of on a case-by-case basis, right? They're not coming out uniformly against every single one. For example, Senator Marco Rubio is likely to be confirmed as Secretary of State on Inauguration Day. It just comes down to the Senate Majority and Minority Leader coming to a time agreement to get that done. In that case, Senator Rubio is someone who a Democratic president obviously would not appoint to this position, but he's someone who Democrats view as a reasonable Republican choice for this job. In the case of Scott Bessent, I think there will be some Democrats who view him as a reasonable Republican choice. But I think most Democrats will probably oppose his nomination. And again, you know, Republicans have said they want to prioritize these national security nominations in the first few days of the new Trump administration. And so it remains to be seen sort of in which order Scott Bessent will come in all of that.
Mark, what's your take?
Well, I think the reality is that Scott Bessent was actually a reassuring pick for a lot of people, including a lot of Democrats. He's really an establishment Republican with an establishment sort of, Treasury, Wall Street background. What my take is to see him get wrapped around the axle whenever he talks about tariffs. I mean, in his gut that this is not something that he wants to do, that he wants to embrace, and he's just. He's going left and right in every way he can to appease the incoming president. But that in his gut and his instincts that's not a natural response for him to go to tariffs. So, which I think is reassuring. But ultimately, he's going to do whatever Trump wants him to do. But I do think he'll try and leaven it however he can through the Treasury.
That's sort of exactly what I'm hung up on, Peter, because everyone likes to say that Donald Trump has no guardrails. But the one place he kind of does is when it comes to the economy. Under no circumstance does he want the stock market or the economy to fall off a cliff. Is Scott Bessent the kind of guy who is going to say, when the rubber hits the road, Mr. President, these policies you are proposing are going to be disastrous?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think Mark is right. I think that he was picked in order to reassure the markets, to reassure the economic, elites in the country, and he's basically done that. And it is striking that Trump, who's willing to go to the far right, to fringe characters for so many other really important jobs, including the FBI, including the department, the director of national intelligence, when it comes to the economic jobs, does stay closer to the traditional establishment reassuring kind of figures like Scott Bessent. But you're right. The question is, how much is he willing to use that influence, to use that position that he's going to get here to advise the president-elect if he doesn't agree with him? How much is he going to push, and how much will the president-elect listen to him? What we heard from Trump, I think, repeatedly over the last 4 years is that the lesson he took from his first term is when people try to stop you from doing things you want to do, don't listen. That's the lesson he took. That too often he listened to people who were establishment and mainstream generals, that kind of thing in the first term, and frustrated the goals he had. This time he has made clear he's not going to be as open to that advice.
Yes, but of course, when you say establishment, like Donald Trump doesn't particularly care about establishment political types or people in the military. He does care about really, really rich Wall Street people. And they were ringing his phone off the hook to ensure that he was going to choose a Scott Bessent or a Mark Rowan. And he certainly likes to have the respect of those guys. All right, let's talk about TikTok, because We have now been told, right? We've been told over and over that this Chinese-based company is a national security threat. A ban was passed through Congress with bipartisan support. That does not happen often. And now the company's CEO will be a VIP at Trump's inauguration. And at the same time, just think about this. The United States recently refused to let a Japanese-owned company invest billions to potentially rescue U.S. steel in Pittsburgh. President Biden and Trump were both against that deal. And of course, Japan is one of our closest allies. So, Peter, you have to explain this one. What in the world is going on here? President Biden is punting the ban, saying, oh, you know, it's the 11th hour. Trump can do it. Trump's potentially trying to avoid it. And now the CEO is going to be sitting in the VIP seat wearing a MAGA hat.
Well, it's very striking, right? Of course, one of the things that President-elect Trump has talked about Panama, when we're talking about the Panama Canal, his complaint is that there are Chinese companies that have contracts there running part of the canal. And that's too much of a threat, he says, to national security. Well, how about a Chinese company that has access to everybody's privacy information, that has access to literally tens of millions of young people's phones in order to position whatever messaging they want to position? That's the whole point of this legislation that Biden signed and that Trump used to support, was the concern over Chinese ownership of this. But Trump has made very clear he has changed his mind for one reason only, because TikTok was useful to him. He has literally said, look how much traction I got off TikTok, how many people said and messaged good things about me on TikTok. Why would I be against it if it was so good for me? He's literally been as clear cut about that as possible. And so, yes, he is going to have sitting with him on the dais of the inauguration, the CEO of a company that, at least by law, is supposed to be banned in the United States 24 hours earlier. That
by law is supposed to be banned, and we may be saying, forget about it. We like our TikTok dances far too much. Andrew, it sure seems like TikTok is causing quite the chaos on the Hill. What can you tell us?
Yeah, look, this was a piece of legislation that passed the House overwhelmingly last year. It was slipped into the foreign aid package that the Senate and the House both passed. Of course, the centerpiece of that was the aid for Ukraine at the time, which got all the attention. But you know, most members of Congress supported this legislation because they recognized the national security threats associated with this social media platform, despite the fact that so many Americans use it. Now we're a few days away from it actually taking effect. There's no buyer for the application, and Democrats in particular didn't want to reckon, publicly at least, with that backlash. And so that's why you saw today people like Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer come out and talk about this issue for the very first time. It's notable because he was avoiding this issue for a very long time last year as it was being debated as part of that foreign aid package that I just mentioned. And suddenly he's coming out today and urging the president publicly to authorize a 90-day extension, basically, which is something that President Biden has the authority to do under the law as written. But in order for that to happen, he has to prove that there is a deal in the works for ByteDance, the parent company, to divest from TikTok. Of course, that is not the case. There is no deal in the works. You even saw the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, Mark Warner, come out today and say the same thing. Senator Warner he was one of the proponents of this piece of legislation, and now coming out and saying, look, President Biden should try to grant that 90-day extension. Meanwhile, you've got Senate Republicans saying, look, the law is the law. We passed this for a reason. The deadline is coming up, and they did not divest. We have to implement this law. Yet the president, the incoming president, of course, from their party, is doing the exact opposite, which is something that a lot of them are privately frustrated about, but are not expressing those frustrations publicly.
All right, Mark, maybe this is the hardest question tonight. Donald Trump's rise to political power was based on populist messaging, right? That has been his jam for the last 10 years, telling regular people that he is on their side. As Kamala Harris had huge support from super wealthy people, right? Remember when President Biden had a $50,000 fundraiser across the street at Radio City Music Hall, and the Trump campaign and Trump supporters were just infuriated over it. This is the most anti-American, super elite thing ever. Juxtapose that with the fact that the three richest men in the world will be sitting directly behind Donald Trump at the inauguration and co-hosting a number of the biggest ticket parties next week.
Yeah, Stephanie, my sense is that this is not just a new chapter in American history, but it's a new book altogether. And President Biden alluded to it in his interview, and it's too bad that Biden didn't show up for the debate with Donald Trump. He was pretty lucid. My overall sense of it is that during Biden and before in American history, our government has been about what's best for the common good of society, the common good of the world, alliances around the world. Donald Trump showed up at a time when in America and arguably around the world, it's just more complicated, more dangerous, more fraught, and that people are scared, and that people like Donald Trump with sort of authoritarian messages that are not necessarily about the benefit of society, but the message is it's about survival. It's survival of the fittest, and I'm the tough guy, and I'm gonna protect you from the rest of the world, from other people coming across the border, you know, the immigrants and people taking your jobs. But it's a survival sort of leadership in a chaotic world. And that goes to this whole sort of transfer of wealth, too. There's this enormous transfer of wealth. And we talk about oligarchy. I mean, that's what's happening. You know, that's what Russia's all about, is transfer of wealth into hands where people control the industries. And we're starting to see that happen here, especially when you see people like tech giants on the dais at an inauguration.
You mentioned Russia. Let's talk about this other thing that happened yesterday. Peter, Speaker Johnson now has officially picked Rick Crawford to chair the House Intel Committee. A lot of people don't know who this guy is, but he's a significantly more MAGA-friendly choice than the former head, who was Mike Turner, fired yesterday, citing Mar-a-Lago concerns. What does this reveal about how the House will run over the next 2 years? Because Mike Turner was a staunch advocate and supporter of Ukraine.
Yeah. I mean, look, first of all, it raises questions about checks and balances, separation of power, right? When does the president of the United States get to decide who chairs a House committee? It used to be that members of Congress guarded their prerogatives pretty strongly against even a president of their own party. They would say, look, you run your branch, we'll run ours. That doesn't seem to be the case here. In this instance, what we're seeing is Donald Trump's dominance of the Republican Party being demonstrated in very stark terms. And not only has Mike Turner been removed from this committee because he was seen as insufficiently loyal, and by the way, I've seen Mike Turner talk. He's not exactly an anti-Trump figure by any stretch. He's used a lot of the same language that Trump has on a lot of issues, but he just wasn't quite as loyal as Trump demands his people to be. And the message is not just about this one slot, although the chairman of the Intelligence Committee is a hugely important slot. It's to every other committee, too. Every other committee chairman gets the message now. Stay in line, because otherwise you could lose your job.